Good evening. It's such a pleasure to welcome you to this special event paying tribute to collaboration, community, history, and education. Tonight, we are celebrating an institutional partnership that has built something larger than the sum of its parts. And we are honoring a remarkable woman who created new approaches to studying history that have transformed classrooms and inspired millions of young people around the world. We look forward to sharing the stories of both the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center and of Margot Sternstrom with you this evening. My name is Rachel King. I'm the Executive Director of the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center at New England Historic Genealogical Society, and I will be your host this evening. When we began planning this event many months ago, it seemed impossible to imagine that by June, many of us would be vaccinated and the world would have started reopening again. We do miss being together with you in person tonight, but we're delighted that you're joining us here in this virtual space from near and far. Before we begin our program, I want to thank the sponsors of this event, who you see here. And I also want to thank the generous benefactors of our 10th anniversary campaign, which supports enhanced educational content and programming, archival collections, and scholarship about Jewish history and heritage. The 10th anniversary campaign is ongoing and runs through this August 31, and we welcome your participation if you are so inclined. Thank you. So we begin this evening by celebrating the partnership that launched in 2010 between two prestigious organizations, the New England Archives of the American Jewish Historical Society and New England Historic Genealogical Society. Over the past decade, this far-sighted collaboration has grown into an important center for education, research, and scholarship about Jewish family and community history in New England and beyond. I'm delighted now to introduce Brenton Simons, CEO and President of American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society, to say a few words. Welcome, Brenton.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and welcome again to all of you to what I know will be a very special program this evening. It is with great pride that we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the collaboration that created the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center at New England Historic Genealogical Society and American Ancestors. In 2010, when we began a partnership of shared resources and expertise with the American Jewish Historical Society's New England Archives, we saw tremendous benefit in sharing resources, expertise, and a commitment to family and community history. Just a decade later, JHC is a truly vibrant center that reaches individuals, families, scholars, and institutions all over the world with its unparalleled archival holdings and resources. We are proud of its mission to preserve and shed light upon the many contributions of Jewish individuals, families, and organizations in Boston, New England, and beyond. We are especially grateful to Jerry Wyner and thank him for his tireless efforts in this cause over many years. We thank the combined Jewish philanthropies, from whom you'll hear more in just a few moments, and the wider Jewish community for supporting a vision that created the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center and enabling this exceptional resource to grow. I also want to thank my colleagues, especially Tom Wilcox and Ryan Woods, for their work in initiating and advancing this special collaboration. And finally, I want to remember three very special individuals who are sadly no longer with us, but whose memories we cherish. Genevieve Wyner, Arthur Obermeyer, and Judy Garner. The JHC is a premier destination for preserving, exploring, and advancing Jewish history and heritage, and with your help, we will continue to grow. We are all excited to see what the next decade holds under the dynamic leadership of Rachel King and her talented team as we serve a community that so greatly benefits from this important work. With that said, let's take just a moment to look at some of what has happened over the past 10 years, from moving in to people to programs and beyond.
This is Mark Baker, President and CEO of Combined Jewish Philanthropies, and I just want to say how grateful I am to the Wyner Center and the incredibly important role it plays in our Jewish community. Think about the concept of archives, archiving CJP's history, our community's history. It is literally the way we stay connected to our past, always remembering where we come from, so that can inform and inspire us as we look toward the future. In addition, the Wyner Center makes sure that we understand how our past as a Jewish community is connected to the history of Greater Boston and the relationships we've built over these many years of creating a strong, thriving Jewish community here in the incredible cultural center of Boston. Thank you, Wyner Center, for keeping us connected to our past, for inspiring us about our future, and for the incredibly important and valuable role you play in our community.
Well, we are grateful to CJP and other partners and to all of you in the community for your support over the last 10 years. I'm so pleased now to introduce my colleague Ryan Woods, Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. Ryan joined New England Historic Genealogical Society 14 years ago as Director of Education and Programming before moving into senior management. He's a graduate of Boston University, and he did his graduate work in education at BU's Center for Character and Social Responsibility, where his focus was on developing character education curricula through teaching biography. With his own background in education, it seems fitting for Ryan to introduce our honoree, Margot Stern-Strom, this evening. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you, Rachel. Indeed, as an educator myself who is focused on teaching character and ethics through history and biography, on behalf of the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center at the New England Historic Genealogical Society, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our Sadaka Lifetime Achievement Award honoree this evening. Since 1976, with the establishment of Facing History in Ourselves, Margot Stern-Strom and her collaborators have inspired millions of students and their teachers around the world to investigate the root causes of prejudice and discrimination, as well as embrace the obligations of a democratic citizenry to participate in the efforts for a more just world. Margot was raised in Memphis, Tennessee during the Jim Crow era of racial segregation and discrimination. From her parents and from her Jewish faith, Margot learned to question the discrimination that she saw around her in the Deep South. She later studied history and received her undergraduate degree at the University of Illinois and her master's degree at Memphis State. As a middle school history teacher in Brookline, Massachusetts, Margot earned her certificate of advanced study from Harvard Graduate School of Education, where she studied moral development, identity formation, and ethical decision-making in adolescence, and developed a classroom pedagogy that recognizes students as moral philosophers. Feeling that students weren't being adequately taught critical world events, in 1976, Margot created the course Facing History in Ourselves, Holocaust and Human Behavior, to examine the human choices and actions that led to the Holocaust and to help her students understand how their moral choices and agency can make a difference. She developed resources and materials with a federal education grant that led to the publication of Facing History in Ourselves, Holocaust and Human Behavior, and the development of a curriculum focused on the failure of democracy in Germany, the systematic process of dehumanization, anti-Semitism, and the steps that led to the Holocaust. During the 1980s, Facing History in Ourselves was incorporated as a not-for-profit organization and designated as a model program by the US Department of Education. Under Margot's 4 decades of leadership, the organization added more curricula and areas of focus for teacher training and classroom learning, and it steadily grew into a global nonprofit working with tens of thousands of teachers to engage students in making connections between past and present, thinking deeply about human choices and actions, and becoming compassionate, engaged citizens. Margot retired as executive director and president of the board in 2014 and assumed the title of President Emerita and Senior Scholar. Beginning with one classroom, she has impacted millions of young people around the world. And as a testament to the lasting impact she has had on young lives, we're delighted that members of her very first class at the Runkle School in Brookline are here with us tonight. Margot has received numerous awards for her work, and I now invite you to watch a brief video created when Margot received the Governor's Award in the Humanities from Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker several years ago.
Since her earliest days as a teacher, Margot Stern-Strom has been a pioneer in the classroom.
Margot Strom is a visionary. She had a unique idea, and she has translated that idea into an organization that has impact around the world.
All of us have 2 or 3 teachers who really changed our lives in a big way, and for me, Margot Strom was one of those teachers.
In 1976, Margot Strom started Facing History in Ourselves in her living room in Brookline.
She has a canny ability to frame educational experiences that invite people to bring their emotions as well as their analytic power.
Middle school students and young high school students are struggling a lot with identity. The Facing History curriculum just has this incredible ability to kind of drill down right in that moment, ask these deep questions about themselves, about their peers, about their place in their family, about their place in their civic community.
Students are so excited by the questions and so moved by them. It spills out into the halls and into the cafeterias and into the home and onto the internet.
Facing History and Ourselves has grown into an international organization with 180 staff around the world. They're surrounded by large communities of support and engaged teachers who educate 3.5 million students every year.
At her core, Margot Strom is devoted to the humanities and to enlarging the recognition of the dignity of every human being.
Before we present Margot with our own award this evening, we are fortunate to be able to see her in conversation with her son, Adam, about their family history, how it shaped Margot, and the impact of her work. Following their conversation, we'll have the opportunity to ask questions, and you can submit your questions for Margot and Adam in the chat function on Zoom. The Strom family has a remarkable record of working for the betterment of our world. And indeed, Adam Strom carries on his family's commitment to education and social justice as the executive director of Reimagining Migration, an organization whose mission is to advance the education and well-being of immigrant origin youth, decrease bias and hatred against young people of diverse origins, and to help rising generations develop the understanding and habits of heart and mind that are necessary to build and sustain welcoming and inclusive communities. Before co-founding Reimagining Migration in 2017, Adam was a longtime member of the senior leadership team at Facing History and Ourselves, where he led the content development team. He has been instrumental in developing educational resources used in tens of thousands of classrooms and experienced by millions of students around the world, including numerous resource books, study guides, films on identity, prejudice, the Holocaust, and human rights. Those works include Crimes Against Humanity, the Armenian Genocide, Stories of Identity, Religion, Migration, and Belonging in a Changing World. What Do We Do with a Difference? France and the Debate Over Headscarves in Schools, and the Viewer's Guide to Eyes on the Prize, America in the Civil Rights Years. Now, please join me for the next part of our program, Margot in conversation with her son, Adam.
Hi, I'm Adam Strom.
And I'm Margot Strom.
Oh, we got in the Stern.
Yes, you did.
So we're going to have a conversation over the next few minutes about kind of family history and genealogy, which is clearly connected to the mission of these great organizations that are honoring you this evening. We've been thinking a lot, actually, about how much family history and genealogy is kind of underneath the work that both of us have done for the years. And so maybe if we take a big picture question for this conversation is how do our family histories and genealogies influence who we are as people and in our work? So I want to start a little bit with your family story, because like a lot of Jews, your family history, at least the family history that you know, doesn't really begin in the United States.
That's right. It doesn't. It begins with religion. It really does. It begins that we know that we were Jewish. From the earliest time, we began to know how we are seen by others and see others.
So this comes with your family from Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
In the story that you told me about your relative getting smuggled out in a coffin, your great-grandmother, your grandmother getting smuggled out in a coffin across the border, is powerful, shocks me.
That's the grandmother.
But yeah, how in the world? I mean, just think about these coming from a shtetl. How do you end up from a small shtetl to Memphis, Tennessee?
Because you had to say that you had some family, and through these Jewish agencies that existed, they were able to help map where you could end up. And they ended up in the family. The grandparents ended up in Memphis because we were related to Goldman's on Beale Street, and mother ended up working there. Wow.
I've seen one of your, I think it's your father's family's name on a census on the Lower East Side. But
Silverman.
But before it was known as primarily a Jewish neighborhood. It was, back then it was Klein Deutschland, Little Germany. But the other part of the family ends up.
And my grandmother, the story goes, was in the fire.
The Triangle
Shirtwaist Fire in New York, because they first lived in New York and came over as refugees.
So genealogy starts bringing all these connections.
My father was a writer.
Yes.
And my mother. And they talked about these things. We lived with the grandmother and grandfather's family in Memphis, but in Chicago, where my grandparents lived, and we were born there. All the children were born there. So we have pictures of us sitting on the lap of another grandmother, and a record they sent here of their voices. Of their voices. There was always connection to family.
Absolutely.
In the old countries.
Absolutely. So, Mom, I've been thinking a little bit about all the different influences of your life, from your relatives way back when to your parents. How do you think that they shaped you as a person, as an educator?
Cry first?
You can cry first if you need to.
Just miss them so much. They totally shaped me. They just provided an atmosphere of love first, eat your spinach second, or whatever else it was. It was putting us in an opportunity to be near our grandparents and the stores that they had and the neighborhoods that moved in and out of being black and white. And I would say being so comfortable with race from the very beginning, and not Yiddish. They talked Yiddish in front of me, so I didn't know what they were saying. They stepped on grapes for every holiday, and so there was a mixture of cultures, truly. And if I spent the night there when they babysat, this was next to ultimately some property that became our
You talked in your grandparents?
Store, yeah, the grandparents. The Wyners, the Zebelinskis, the people who spoke to each other so that I wouldn't understand them. But my father was an author as well, and my mother a Sunday school teacher. We belonged to an Orthodox Barenhurst congregation, and that was really significant. My brother was bar mitzvahed. I was not bat mitzvahed. My sister was, among 13 or 14 other young girls in an Orthodox synagogue. But my father and mother were good in their ways of being Jewish. My father would stand outside on a Friday night, always with the car door open, so that we would go to high holiday services or go to services during the day. Yeah. And he always gave his opinion to the rabbi on the way out. So after a while, when I heard some of the things he was saying, why aren't you doing more on civil rights? And so the house, their small house was a meeting place for the families that stayed. My mother grew up on top of the
dry goods store. Yeah,
it was first a grocery store, then a dry goods store when my uncle took it over. So there was just a mixture of families all the time, and it was good.
Was that on Wells Avenue?
It was Wells and Thomas, so it was near where Firestone was, which meant that there was increasingly a very large Black population there, Coca-Cola buildings, and then it wasn't far from Millington Air Force Base.
So you told me you later learned what Wells Avenue was. What's Wells Avenue?
Ada B. Wells, and I made sure I taught her, and that she was taught at Facing History in Memphis, and that she was known by all of the girls in the private schools.
So you laugh. Why do you laugh?
Because it was not just Ada B. Wells. There were a group of amazing women in Memphis who were, as you do when you are taking an idea from another place, and they dug deep. And our leader in Memphis was dedicated to making sure that our schools were Black and white. And I had experience in a school that was, I took I'll say it very quickly, but two of my very good friends in Memphis when I went home one time, just to one of the schools. And it didn't occur to me that they had not ever been in an all what was then called colored school. But I'd already just met with the superintendent, who was African American, and things had been changing, and the mayor had changed. And ever since we started Facing History back in Memphis and in the South, the Holocaust survivors who were there, but I didn't know when I grew up that they were Holocaust survivors. So we discovered this whole new jewel of a history. Facing History in Memphis is a great pride to me, as it is in Chicago, as it is in everywhere, because the first two cities were Chicago and Memphis.
The places of your childhood.
The places of my childhood. That's really true. So we were in Hyde Park, and we've just made such amazing, in every city there are these people waiting to be really in leadership in their fashion, and the people they know, and then the discovery of the Holocaust survivors that we've been living among their grandchildren in school. So I'm now in a call that happens once a month with my kids that I went to kindergarten with.
So let's talk a little bit about Memphis just a little bit more. I know that about 9 months after I was born, you went down to Memphis, late March, April 1968. And that was, you were there the evening that Martin Luther King was assassinated. Can you talk a little bit about that night?
Well, 1968 was just so scary. We were watching television again that day. My sister and myself were home, and Adam was a baby.
Me?
You were there, very little, and visiting. And the news got interrupted and said Martin Luther King was killed. When Martin Luther King was killed in Memphis, it was personal.
Yeah.
It was personal, totally personal. And the building of that tribute to him there, and the work that the city had to do to make up for what it had done, just influenced everything that Facing History did. Race was always an issue, an issue. Where you drove, what you knew. So when Facing History started there in the school system, with the first woman who showed up at my house, showed up with no snowshoes, knocked on the door and said, "I'm from Memphis. I've heard about Facing History. I want to start it there," which she is now one of my best friends and started one of the best programs ever. There were people everywhere who wanted to get involved with Facing History. And Bill Parsons was my partner when we started. We started learning the history of the Holocaust. I, of course, thought he knew it. And the reason we started is because the superintendent, Bob Sperber, was having his teeth cleaned. Now, these are great stories, aren't they? And his dentist said to him, "Do you teach about the Holocaust in Brookline, Massachusetts?" And Bob Sperber said, "No, but I will." And he called the head director of social studies, Dr. Henry Zabrook, who'd been in World War II, knew about the history better than I certainly did, or Bill. And we were two of about 10 people on staff for social studies in the schools in Brooklyn.
How did you end up this is Facing History's first book. I don't know how many editions you've done now, but talk to me about how that's the second edition. Talk to me about how the heck did this come together?
It came together because I started to talk to the people at Brookline in my school and ask if I could try to learn about the history of the Holocaust. And I went to a conference, and Bill Parsons was sitting next to me, and he taught at Lincoln School, where you went later, and Rachel too. And I just wrote up with Bill and I, we just started learning about the Holocaust by interviewing my cousin, Rose Mira, and her husband was sitting there being told to be quiet while she talked. And he too was a Holocaust survivor and a soccer player that the Nazis would allow in the camps to play his soccer to stay alive. And Rose was in Auschwitz, and they all told those stories.
And Rose was in many camps.
In many camps, that's true. So one day, one of my parents, the kids I was teaching, asked if I would come to dinner, and another one did that as well. And the first one was a man who owned an art gallery, and he started to advertise us in a way with his artwork and to get close to us and to be sure I that he helped me meet people and in Boston and teachers and so on. And then he would collect the art of a man named Sam Bach. I still have something here of him. I have a number of things of his. And Sam Bach is still an artist who was raised by his mother in different hiding places and in Vilna, and by concentration camp people also who taught him to paint. And so he was at some point in relationship.
Well, I know that in the ghetto they had an art show when he was 9 years old.
Oh gosh, he is such an amazing man.
Yeah.
So I met this man, Sam Bach, the artist, and began to love his work, and my husband did too.
Talk about teaching that work.
And I taught Sam Bach's work. The next day, they had taken me to Joseph Gurian's mom and dad, who I was teaching, said, my parents want to take you tonight to Brandeis to see an exhibit by an artist and to hear another artist speak. So I went two different times. And all of a sudden, there was this layer of people at this Runkle school that all had some desire to see that I succeeded in learning about.
But talk about the kids, like where they were.
The kids were just astounding. They just were astounding. And that was because the librarian or the filmmaker, in the town would come in and film them. And their questions were so powerful. I've met with them still. Judy Sidney is one of them in a class that was not the first. It may have been the first class, but I've had reunions with these kids and still in relationship to the first class that I was teaching at all. So it's like they adopted Facing History in Brookline because it was a Title IV grant and I'd had a Title III grant, so I knew what I was doing, but I didn't know the history of the Holocaust until I interviewed Rose Mura, Terry's cousin, and Nathan, and board members who said to me, why don't you have a dinner for Facing History? And I thought, no, I did that in sorority in Memphis, sorority in college. I don't think that I'm going to do that. And they said, yeah, we'll do it. They had a dinner, and Father Robert Bullock was the chair of that dinner. And Father Robert Bullock was my teacher and ultimately became a best friend of the family. And he was the Catholic priest who was called the Holocaust priest. And he taught the most beautiful lessons in classrooms. He could turn a classroom around that was rowdy. He taught all of our workshops and institutes and traveled. I also don't like to travel in groups very well, but I did go to Poland and with one of the groups early. So I wasn't leading it as much as I was learning it because 2 Holocaust survivors went with us, Sonia Weitz and Rena Fender. Rena's still a best friend. I still talk to her on the phone, and Sonia spoke in classes all over.
And so the people, just to get it on the record, Rena was, if not the youngest, one of the youngest people on Schindler's List.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for sure, Spielberg got involved with us with the help of my brother in California. And this whole thing became a family effort about teaching about the history of the Holocaust with survivors teaching us. And now my grandson, named after one of them, who's written him a letter I read last night thinking about you all. He wrote an email that talked to my grandson for when he grows up to explain how he hid during the Holocaust in Amsterdam. Yeah.
What do you think your mom and your dad and your grandfather and your grandmother would say about your work?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. First, my grandmother would speak in Yiddish. So I still wouldn't know what she was saying until I asked my mother.
She didn't speak English?
It was broken, and she lived with us for a long time.
Yeah, actually, tell the story about your dad at dinner with them. So she kept kosher and?
My dad just seemed to like butter, meat with meat. And so he would keep it in his lap or break the rules.
But
it's where I learned Judaism. It's where, hamburgers were cooked in matzah meal. It's where in the backyard they had their own chicken. I'm going
to tease you. The question I asked you
What was it?
wasn't about other people. The question I asked you was about yourself.
Because it was like the best learning I've ever done.
What do you think your parents, your grandparents would make of your work?
I know what. My dad moved in this house after my mother died. My mother still wrote me about how proud she was of this work.
One of the things that I think is really important is while you're honoring that particular history of the Holocaust, you are trying to encourage people to think larger about moral and ethical questions.
No question.
So I remember you telling me the story about bringing Arn Chorn Pond, who is a survivor of the Cambodian genocide, to speak at a conference and then later classroom after classroom. Can you tell people a little bit about the responses to from some of the survivors who must have been going, "What are you doing?" And then the connections that kids were making.
Oh my gosh. They understood the word genocide from the beginning. You know, that's what we worked on. What is it? By bringing in people who also spoke about it and scholars.
So what did the survivors make of Arn?
Some of them fell in love.
Why do you think?
Because they didn't know his history, because they saw videotapes of him, they saw how kids responded. This wasn't a comparative Holocaust. This wasn't a comparative genocide. These were human beings. So it became that part of our title, Facing History and Ourselves, Holocaust and Human Behavior. It never was something that didn't look at the particular and the universal.
What does that name mean? I remember Elie Wiesel talked for Facing History, and Elie Wiesel began his talk saying he always said you should just be facing history. So what's the difference between a name Facing History and Facing History and Ourselves? I'm going to tell you what I think, and then you can respond to that. I think that if you're just facing history, you're building a memorial to the past. But if you're facing history and ourselves, you're recognizing a continuity in human behavior.
It's no question about it.
Right? You're saying that this stuff happened because human beings were involved. And there are particulars that we need to know, but we're still human beings. My wife is an artist, and so Sandy has this drawing where she did a series of stonings, and she draws these rocks. And she reminds us that it's not the rock that is the problem. It's a human being that weaponizes the rock that is the problem. And it strikes me that that's very true of genocide, right? That there's a reminder in that title that we're human beings, and we may not be enacting the Holocaust, but they're threads of human behavior. So does that resonate with you?
Absolutely. So that we would go back to the doctors and have a doctor's conference and invite doctors who were new to doctoring and doctors planning these conferences. And we would take a subject from the topics and you would.
And to make it explicit, the doctors today having to wrestle with the choices that the doctors made then, the lawyers today having to wrestle with the questions and choices made by the lawyers in the past, folks in the military, folks in the police.
It's always and continues to this day to be not a fascination as much as a human behavior reminder and where we are in danger.
I mean, Michael Barenbaum was a scholar of the Holocaust and helped kind of really envision the Holocaust Museum in DC. Michael talks about the Holocaust for him as a moral touchstone.
Michael Barenbaum, there would be no me without him. I still am in a project with him now.
Make this connection, do you think, to across generation to these questions of social justice in the Stern family? Where did your work, where does my work fit in this continuity from your perspective of kind of an evolving commitment to social justice in your family?
No question about it. Where does it come from? It comes from my mother and my father, who were writers and thinkers and believed in this mixture of a black and white world in a place of Memphis that wasn't there yet. And we grew up with these families and we went to the furniture store where they ultimately opened, and we sat there as children and met all the people, and then they gave credit when no one else gave credit. That was such a big thing for me to learn, that African Americans weren't given in the beginning credit. And when Martin Luther King was killed at home, my mother stayed at the store all night with the people of the neighborhood.
And Gerald?
And Gerald was at the Justice Department. 3 people were hired. John Kennedy called his brother and said, I want a civil rights division. So 3 people were hired, and my brother heard about it, and he applied because he'd just come back from around the world, and he's got all the credentials to be there. And he got hired as one of 3 people, and they took on creating the Civil Rights Division. And Gerald was assigned to Mississippi.
But what about Paula?
Paula came dancing into the world and reading into the world. So when I watched Loretta Young or any television show I wanted, she would walk in and say, why haven't you read a new book? And I went to Hebrew school until they called me Malky. And at that point, I decided that I didn't say I wasn't mature enough. I just wasn't going to take the bus there anymore because it was far away, and it was Baron Hirsch in its olden days. And everyone was speaking Yiddish, and Paula was learning it and learning Hebrew. And she became a Hebrew scholar and a Yiddish scholar and a Middle East scholar.
And continues working on real issues of gender equity today.
So I learned from my siblings.
Absolutely. And your parents. And I learned from you. So, Mom, thanks for the conversation. It's really a pleasure to kind of mine memories. It's beautiful. But we also want to kind of continue this conversation with y'all. And so I know that Ryan is going to moderate Q&A. So we'll actually do that live. So looking forward to the continued conversation with y'all. Thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you, Margot and Adam. I can't help but think you spoke so powerfully of the personal nature of Martin Luther King Jr.'s death happening in Memphis. And it makes me think of the words that Robert Kennedy brought to light on that occasion, that he learned from educator Edith Hamilton: to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. We should dedicate ourselves to that. And I can't help but think that has been an undercurrent of all that you have done with Facing History and ourselves. As we look to take a few minutes for questions from the audience, I'd like to spend just a moment asking a few questions of my own. It's been mentioned that you've maintained connections with your very first Facing History and Ourselves class, students now from some 45 years ago. Why do you think that bond has been so strong?
Because that class taught me through their journals of anything that I was struggling with or teaching, or bringing speakers in to talk with them and us, all the way from a woman who was grown as a young Nazi leader and who lives in our neighborhood and knits things for my babies when they're born and is a wonderful friend still. And took care of all of us who started Facing History. Bill Parsons and I must have had more meals there and other things. And finding the humanity in her talks with kids who were in Facing History, learning about Hitler, learning about the German children in the camps that they were in, not the concentration camps, obviously that's the word camp, and the Holocaust that goes so much together as they should. But these were her Nazi youth camps.
But what is it? He's asking about you and the kids. Why do you still have a relationship with them?
Because the program and what they learned and what they wrote in their journal was so powerful and so meaningful that they wanted a reunion. And Judith Sidney, who's watching tonight, I think, still has a program of that class that, if all goes well, I'm a part of. And they remember the survivors who spoke, the parents who were involved. They remember everything they learned, every film. The whole school turned around at Runkle School. The librarian brought in new films. Parents said, I know somebody, and wrote me to say, I'm okay with what you're doing with the students and it's powerful. And they all kept journals. And those journals became a PhD thesis under Carol Gilligan, written by Betty Bardage. And Carol was at Harvard, and a number of professors started getting involved, and I was in graduate school for part of it, because they saw I wrote about nothing but the students' voices that were so new and complex and full of pathos that was moral education from what one would take, but hadn't been offered before. So I thought that's what was happening in my students. They were teaching me.
In our conversations leading up to tonight and what we saw in your conversation with Adam, you've been bountiful in the credit that you give to others for the formation of Facing History in Ourselves and its growth. While our audience may not know by name some of the characters, can you say something about where you found support and collaborators for these efforts and how that has grown over time?
Bill Parsons was a teacher that was hired in the social studies department and taught in a school, Lincoln School. And both of us together had been teaching in one of the 7 schools, Marty Sleeper and others, at Baker and so on. And the director of social studies, Dr. Henry Zabrick, took this on because Bob Sperber, the superintendent, bravely took it on and said, I want this to happen at my school system. It's the same thing he did with a lot of other projects that were government funded. And this meant I had already had a book that I had done on sex role stereotyping that he supported with his team, and the school committee did at a time when people weren't doing that. And I have other stories on that. And but they published the book and they sold it and they deliberately backed it up, and sex role stereotyping became an issue that was quite legitimate ultimately for schools.
Can I just say to what Margot's saying, I think is really important here. You know, there's been a lot of work about what does it take to like bring communities together. And often the missing piece of this is the role that authority plays, right? The authority in a community, the role that leadership in a community plays. And it's Brookline at that moment had leaders who were willing to take the heat, because sometimes this meant heat. And I think that that's really powerful in an age where so much of the backlash that happens is so public. It's like, what are you going to do when the backlash happens? And those folks got your back.
And also it was interdisciplinary. So the students would say, when I would show them an artist and Sam Bach's work that I learned about.
Yeah, you mentioned the art teacher jumping in.
Jumped in. No, they said, we can't get an A in art for that. That apple doesn't look like an apple. I said, well, go get her. And they went upstairs and they brought her down to the classroom, and she became absolutely intimate to the program. And the principal became able to change her agenda during the day so that she could be with classrooms. So I learned from her. The librarian would bring in new books. Films would come from this person who'd been hired in Brookline to do film it and to bring video for the first time. There was just so many people who knew nothing, like I literally didn't. Everybody who we asked as a Holocaust survivor, Reese Vanderpool, my grandson is named after him, Reese. And the people who came out of the ground who were Holocaust survivors that I didn't know, and the woman who was raised as a German youth, able to literally reach these 8th graders at the time, I think. And I was also studying moral development at the time. And so I had these different links to people and to publishers.
My mother is a brilliant weaver, where she'll take a little bit of some idea that's there and take a little bit of that idea there. And I really do think that the underappreciated genius, her underappreciated genius, is that there was all this work being done at that time on moral development education. She's studying with Lawrence Kohlberg, who was taking these abstract moral dilemmas, right? And you were thinking about them. And she said, well, let's actually, why work with the abstract stuff? Real history, is much more complicated and full of just as powerful dilemmas and choices to struggle with.
And it's the trust in the students. I had done this work on sexual stereotyping, but they taught me. And when it was time to start seeing new films that were out about the Holocaust, or we had a conference on Nuremberg, and Telford Taylor came, he was the chief prosecutor, Ben Ferenz, who was there. All of these people turned these kids on, and they turned them on. And everybody I asked to speak, and the scholars at UMass and other places, they really paid attention in class. And Father Robert Bullock was critical to be able to come in and talk about Christian roots of anti-Semitism.
Just as a point of interest, one of the names you mentioned just a bit ago is Dr. Robert Sperber, who is the superintendent of schools in Brookline. And we're very proud to have his archive as part of the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center at the New England Historic Genealogical Society. So for those who may be interested in the development of this program and many other things in the education system in Brookline, and the work that Bob Sperber did in Brookline and at Boston University, we have those papers just as a point of interest. Something that was noted in the introductory video, Andrew Dreyfus mentioned how there are teachers who impact us greatly in our lives. And this weaves into one of the questions from our audience. Was there a teacher that you had that had a significant impact on your life and the work that has come about since?
I don't want to answer for you, but I always think that where I usually hear you talk is actually more about not what the teachers did positively, but what the teachers didn't do that needed to be done.
Colored day only at the zoo, sitting across the street from social studies class, and not one time ever was it a part of the curriculum, or hello, did you pass it today again? Any issues of race? Our street at some point was a federal, I asked Martha Minow about this at Harvard. She knows this history well.
You said that there are street people couldn't cross through her street to go to the
zoo if they were colored, COLORED. Or once in the back of, I would sit in that, the place in a bus where you could be near the back way to get out, because it's smaller spaces behind that. And I would always choose to sit where I thought I could sit anywhere I wanted. So I would sit where I felt like I was making some kind of a statement to myself. And later, as I went to the museum in Memphis about the history of the civil rights movement and saw, what Rosa Parks did and on a bus, I can understand, because that's how we got anywhere in Memphis. If you didn't drive, or if your brother wasn't forced to take you.
So your point is that the teachers ducked it.
Well, it's not the teachers, it's the textbooks first. It still is, it's who's buying the textbooks, who's writing the textbooks, who's invited to be part of the classroom, and how strict is, we watch Gone with the Wind 400,000 times when it rained or snowed in Memphis. There wasn't that many times, excuse the number, but it was a quarter each time. And that's the show they showed. So that was our history of like the Civil War. And when we were taught things, I would remember my brother, Gerald, it might be watching this, so if I get it wrong, I'm sorry. But there was ROTC at our schools, which is the early introduction into uniforms and being able to follow orders and do things that would happen to these boys when they were ultimately going to be in the armed services. There was one, Paula, my sister, I know is watching, and I remember when she was a cheerleader, you were at Snowden, I think, and it seemed to be okay to be Jewish. But when it got to be time, there were times where there were limits to how many Jews they could have on the cheerleading team at high school. There were just these things that just went on among the religions in Memphis that were, that impacted our public schools, for sure.
Just mentioning Memphis, one of our audience members Rachel Shankman said, "I will forever be grateful that you trusted me with helping bring Facing History to Memphis. You continue to inspire so many of us. We love you."
Well, what we did is we held public conferences and then we held big exhibits. And the Facing History staff put them on. Erica Stern led this for the whole office by then. But the truth is, the people who educated me were these volunteers who lived in Brookline. I wasn't from Brookline, but lived in Boston as well. And they were part of the Jewish community here. And I didn't know anyone in the Jewish community here. And I lived in the Maimonides area, section, and good people live next door, the Gopins, and still see him on occasion when he's around. And he became an advisor at some point to us on some histories, and so did Bob Bullock. And it became, the classrooms were so interesting, and the workshops and institutes, you can invite anybody to come, and they said yes.
Something you just said leads into one of our audience questions from Stephen Greenberg. Do you attach the lessons on morality to Jewish values? And if so, how?
Well, that's a question no one ever asked me. Let's think about that. I guess I would do that first through the eyes of my family, through the following of my grandparents' kosher cooking, through the ways they stamped on grapes before the Seder began, to all the holidays that we practiced. To my brother's bar mitzvah, I saw he had a big cake, and I thought I should have one of those, but I didn't. My sister was one of, what were you call it, maybe 13 people who marched through an Orthodox synagogue aisle to be bat mitzvahed. I didn't do any of those ceremonies. Somehow I went to Sunday school, and I learned a lot from my grandparents, and they spoke Yiddish so that I didn't understand a lot of what they said as well.
So the
But,
question is,
yeah.
do you connect that to the history?
Oh, I totally connected to history. Totally. Where did they come from? Who are they? Why was there an African-American woman, Bee Bunley, who stood up at my mother and dad's wedding in Memphis? He was a Northerner and she is Southerner. These labels mattered then, totally. And then their furniture store was part of some property the grandparents owned, and the dry goods store next door, my mother had grown up on the top floor, and then my uncle lived there and my cousins. And it was very mixed, and I was very used to being able to be there on Saturdays and then work there because they gave credit very early to African Americans. So there was just, it was in there until my brother joined the Justice Department. It wasn't as visible and scary. So I'll tell you quickly one story. When my brother was home one time, I think we were going to Elvis that night, so it was sighting night. And he was fiddling around with his guitar. And I walked out to the mailbox and I pulled down the mail, and there was a envelope thick like that, and then a postcard. And the postcard was written in circles about how they were going to kill my brother. And that Gerald was actually, I think, Gerald, I know you're watching, so you can correct me sometime, but not now. He was ultimately, he was called from the Justice Department to pick up the bullet that had to do with Medgar Evers' death. So he was there to take testimony on why African Americans couldn't vote. And that's a period of my history at that time, and my home, and my parents never said any things about the fear, but I felt it. And when I read that postcard, I never forgot them. And years later, the Southern Poverty Law Center was started, and I saw that at some point in their newsletter, that I'm not going to say their names out loud.
But they wrote about the same
They
family.
wrote about the same family.
So I'm going to do a quick, my read of your answer to the question was, well, religion may be part of it. It was also is very much about your own identities as they evolved in that historical context.
Yeah.
And that sort of shaped the way that you think about the history.
Well, when my father, let me just say
think.
one thing, last thing, so I can talk about it. The word humiliation really took on power, because I felt humiliated when the police, who were white, stopped the car that an African American who was working with my mom and dad had used to pick me up and drive me somewhere. And they stopped him to say, why are you with this white girl? You could feel that I would say all the time. If you went to the Malco Theater then, or Beale Street, and went to certain places, the Peabody Hotel, everything was segregated. There wasn't an integration until there was an integration movement that happened in that city. And I think Facing History benefited from that change and Rachel Shankman's leadership and the people who joined the board and the survivors we never knew we grew up with. I never knew that. Never knew it.
We have many, many more questions, but in the interest of time, I'd like to ask a question to Adam as a sort of concluding part of this segment. How would you say that your mother's work and what she helped birth with Facing History and Ourselves has influenced you as the next generation in the Strom family?
Well, for a lot, God, so many ways. I want to say the first thing, and Peter Nelson and Fred Matthews Waller in this call, so I'll tell them. So first of all, I cared deeply about education, but I didn't want to do it the way that my mother did because I was a kid, right? So I went off and I worked in Hollywood, and I was like, oh, nothing to do with that. I thought I'd use media to do education work. Hated it. It was awful. And I quit and I started teaching. And I realized I did know somebody who could help me teach. And so I started calling, send me something that kids will like, send me something. And then I went to at the end of that year, I ended up going to a Facing History seminar, and I sat next to Peter a lot of that time, Peter. And I remember thinking, oh, damn, she's really good. The work is really, really good. And so I think it was a respect that the program built for teachers that sparked a different way of thinking about education for me. And then I will say that my mom has also always been interested in following new ideas. And so for me, both she and I think, got very interested after 9/11 as we started to think about this migratory world that we live in, right? Where global exchange happens so fast, and people have been talking about money and globalization, but what about the role that people play? And so I think my work now is an extension of some of the curiosity that we began when I was doing the work at Facing History. I just felt that somebody needed to pay attention to the particulars of the way that the world responds to migration, because we have an urgency right now. So I feel like I'm building on her legacy, but I feel like the particular matters, and we are in a particular moment. There are every 2 seconds, 1, 2, somebody in the world was just displaced. There are 1 billion people living outside of the places where they were born right now. 25% of the kids in our schools are immigrants or the children of immigrants. Learning how to work with those people, the way that the Holocaust was 30 years, 40 years, 50 years ago was like that. Nobody works with teachers on how do you go and respond and build the best out of the assets that these immigrant origin kids bring into these schools. Nobody is helping us start to combat the myths and prejudices that are spewed at these immigrant kids. And so I feel like my work is, to the best that I can do, is building off a legacy of somebody awfully smart who's better than me at it.
Well, I want to thank both of you ever so deeply for sharing these insights and perspectives. Here at the Jewish Heritage Center and across our larger institution, we hold 3 aims at our purpose: to educate, inspire, and connect people. And you, Margot, and you, Adam, have both done so much and continue to do so much on these fronts that we can't help to feel in kindred spirits with you. And so we thank you for being able to have a view into your work and your family and the inspirations for what you do.
Right back at you. I just want to say real quick, and I'll turn to my mother, but we're back at you. And Brian, our work starts with yours, with the families, by helping us recognize our own places and the genealogies that situate us in the worlds where we are now. So I feel like we're kindred spirits as well.
And I would also like to end by, someone came up to me when I was new here in Brookline and said, would you please go and volunteer at Temple Israel? I didn't even know where it was, and it was close. And I volunteered because they were rewriting the textbook for the kids in Sunday school, in junior high school. And I was sitting there, and a rabbi came up to me and tapped me on the shoulder. And he said, I know about you, and I know about Facing History. He had learned it from a woman named Fran Putney, who was on it in the community, and certainly has been on our board. And he said, so I have a name, and he handed me the name, Richard Smith. And I thought, okay, who's that? I don't know. I don't know the temple, and I didn't know. And he said, I want you to go see him. And I made an appointment, and his secretary let me sit in the office when I got there. And then he opened the door, and he handed me a check. And he said, you're not here about a check. You're here to tell me where you're going to go in 10 years. And he took it on, became the chairman of the board. He taught me more about philanthropy, including how to spell it, probably. But and he became chairman of the board. And one of the schools that I was teaching in was his grammar school, Runkle School in Brookline. So he took to it. The principal, Marty Sleeper, who may be on this, he's also written about his family, had a bell from the school that he gave him as a gift. And that couldn't have been anything better than someone who'd been grammar school there and now was head of General Cinema and all of the things that they've done. And with their
this is Rachel, and that what you just said, Margot, leads perfectly to our award ceremony, because I did want to say that as you have demonstrated this evening and in every conversation I've had with you, you are so gracious and generous about giving so many other people credit for your accomplishments. And we are here tonight to give you credit. And so for your work, teaching the next generation to consider the human choices behind historical events, and teaching children to put themselves in other shoes and become upstanding citizens, and for your family's commitment through the generations to social justice, and for leading your life according to the Jewish values of tzedakah and tikkun olam, justice and repairing the world. We are so honored to present you, Margot Sternstrom, with the 2021 Tzedakah Lifetime Achievement Award from the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center. And we'd like to ask you to open your gift.
Do we have to mute while she does it?
Oh, I'm so thankful.
Oh, rip away.
Yeah.
I'll tell you this, I've never learned to use a computer or type. And my mother said to me when I was signing up for Central High School, you have to sign up for typing. I said, no, because I'll end up with no choices of what I'll be. So I had no idea that y'all would end up me on your camera.
Those are beautiful. And I'll why don't you show people?
Okay. Can y'all see it? How's that? Bad? Want me to
Can you read the inscription?
Of course, I did learn to read longhand. Let's see, 2021 Tzedakah Lifetime Achievement Award presented to Margot Sternstrom. Oh, I'm gonna cry because you spelled my name right and gave me a T at the end of Margot. In recognition of your exemplary contributions to education, historical inquiry, and social justice, the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center at New England Historic Genealogical Society. And to the team who put this whole program together, and who, Rachel, and all of you who called me and have been so kind, I thank you. And to Adam, who has done everything to videotape the tape and do all things with you all.
Well, thank you. And as always, you are thanking other people. Congratulations, Mazel Tov. We're so pleased to honor you. We look forward to working with you and Adam in the future. And thank you for being part of our program this evening. I do want to recognize someone else in this program, a member of the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center's community, who has been an invaluable contributor to our growth. Originally from Boston's North Shore, Herb Selesnik has his BS, master's, and PhD degrees from MIT, and is co-founder with his wife, Hinda Sterling, of Sterling and Selesnik, an organizational consulting firm that has worked with federal, state, and local agencies, blue chip companies, and nonprofit organizations. Herb was on the board of the Jewish Heritage Center of the North Shore when he helped facilitate the donation and transfer of that organization's collections to our archive in 2016. These rich collections documenting the history of Jewish families, organizations, and communities north of Boston are such an important addition to our holdings, and we are honored to preserve and steward them. We are also pleased to have Herb and Hinda's own family papers in our archive. As a member of the Jewish Heritage Center's Advisory Council since 2016, Herb recently led the Advisory Council in a year-long strategic planning process, offering his consulting services pro bono and guiding council members and staff to develop a valuable 5-year plan for the Jewish Heritage Center. Herb, you are a model of generous volunteer and community service, and you live your Jewish values. With gratitude for your dedication to the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center and for making us stronger with your wisdom, guidance, and expertise, I'm so honored to present you with our 2021 Volunteer Leadership Award. And unfortunately, due to some technical glitches, we don't have Herb's physical award yet, but it will arrive soon at his home. And it reads, the 2021 Volunteer Leadership Award presented to Herbert Selesnik in gratitude for your contributions to the growth of the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center and your commitment to Jewish history and community. Mazel tov, Herb.
Wow. Thank you for those incredibly kind words, Rachel. In a 48-year management consulting career, and during the most recent half dozen years volunteering for nonprofits, I have worked with, as you can imagine, numerous agencies, organizations, and groups. The most memorable positive experiences occur when I have an opportunity to work with a group of accomplished, knowledgeable people who are genuinely committed to an exceptionally worthwhile undertaking. This rewarding experience describes my association with the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center's Advisory Council and staff. That you choose to commend my volunteer role publicly says at least as much about the Jewish Heritage Center as it does about me. Frankly, the award is frosting on the cake. I will remember this moment and how moved I was and am by your gracious gesture. My sincere thanks to all of you.
Congratulations. Thank you so much, Herb. And that brings us almost to the end of this program. Before we conclude, I do want to mention 2 upcoming programs this summer. On July 20th, the Jewish Heritage Center is co-sponsoring a program with the author of the newly published book, Plunder, a memoir of family property and Nazi treasure. And starting next week, American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society is offering a 3-part course on researching your Polish ancestors. I hope you'll join us for these and other programs. I invite you to learn more about the Wyner Family Jewish Heritage Center at New England Historic Genealogical Society at our website, jewishheritagecenter.org. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and we hope to see you again soon, online and in person. Please enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks for joining us.